Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is a continuation of the Q&A from my talk on the amazingly idiosyncratic history of passports from a few weeks ago. There was just such great interest and super questions from the audience. I wanted to get a chance to answer some more of them. So that's what we're doing here today. So yeah, we'll just get right started. So the first question here is, how did the passport's shape and size come to be? And this is a super question. It really is fundamental to my argument, really, about how this history is just so quirky and idiosyncratic. How that came to be is random. Never did countries all agree this is what the passport should look like. And so, for example, in the past, a lot of passports were just single sheets of paper, and they had whatever information the authority wanted to include. Sometimes they were quite beautifully decorated. This background here that was both in the original talk and I've got here today comes from this early 19th century French passport. And it's got, I don't know how much you can see, this bucolic travel scene going on in the background. In the Holy Roman Empire that preceded modern Germany, there were a lot of independent or quasi-independent city-states. And so sometimes instead of an aristocratic coat of arms, those would have across the top this very beautiful aerial view sort of the city. And so that's what passports looked like for a long time. And what people would do is when they started to be seen or visa stamps on them, they would just stamp them on the back of this piece of paper. And so you'd have this big piece of paper, you'd fold it up, and then you'd unfold it to get stamps on it. And so folding up the piece of paper gave the idea of, well, why don't we turn this into a little booklet? And it was after the First World War that the League of Nations came together, tried to abolish passports, tried to get states at least to agree on passport standards, and they failed. But they did put out recommendations that some countries chose to follow. Of course, they didn't need to because this wasn't a law. And so those recommendations were about a booklet of this size with this sort of information in it. But again, not requirements. And so every country is free to have a shape and a size of a passport as ever they'd like, and to include beautiful images, include what sort of information they want, include biometrics if they want. So again, it's a function of the history that it developed in these weird ways. But the important development from a single piece of paper to that booklet is this idea of stamping the back randomly and then folding up the document. And then someone had the idea, well, why don't we actually create a booklet with proper pages where you can actually stamp rather just on the back of the document itself. So the next question relates actually to what I was just saying about these images. The person asks, as an American passport holder, I always find the patriotic quotes lining every page of the booklet incredibly humorous. To what extent have you found passports as symbols of patriotic loyalties? And in your opinion, have they exacerbated inequality and discrimination? I'll come back to inequality and discrimination later. There are a number of questions on that theme. But on the subject of these designs, it's true, it is kind of humorous. The Canadian passport recently did something similar and redesigned the passport with, instead of just bland pages or pages with the background image of the coat of arms or something of the country, Canada and the United States started including these quotations in the United States passport. There are lines from the Declaration of Independence, from the US Constitution, and then images as well that kind of tell a story, a very simplified, a very whitewashed story of these countries' history. The American passport begins with the arrival, I think, of the Mayflower, and ends on the very last page. There's a picture of a satellite in space. And so, this passport goes from the terrestrial literally to space. But again, the narrative of American history is it all started with the Mayflower, and now, it's going off into space. Now, of course, they don't include a lot of images of, the genocide of Native Americans. They don't include images about, the many slaves who were brought to America, enslaved peoples who were brought to America. And I'll come back to that too. There was a very good question about slavery and passports. The Canadian passport also has these kind of funny images. Some are from Canadian history, some are from contemporary Canadian culture. There's an image of kids playing hockey, ice hockey in the winter, which is just a very Canadian image. But yeah, it's part of just this history of the design of these documents, sometimes including these design features, but also, yeah, telling a story about the country, which is meant to sort of inculcate pride, I think, in the holders of these documents. All right. Next question. You mentioned technological changes at several points, including your own travels, and I'm wondering whether any changes in travel technology have caused these idiosyncratic developments. In particular, did the advent of the jet age after World War II and the expansion of air travel more generally cause any distinctive shifts in the practice of passports? Absolutely. Absolutely correct. There are two really big instances when travel changed, the travel technology changed, and it had an impact on passports. And the first was in the 19th century. That period, as I mentioned in the talk, when they abolished passports in the mid-19th century, all the way through till the advent of the First World War and Leo being able to get on the Titanic without a passport. One of the reasons they did that, I'm arguing in my book, is because of the advent of mass rail travel. It just became too cumbersome to check all of these people who now in these brand new big trains were crossing borders all together at once, that they kind of said, you know what, let's not bother. And they said that for a couple of reasons. One, it just became practically very difficult. Another reason is because most people traveling were affluent, upper middle class people. And so governments were not as concerned about controlling them as they were concerned about controlling other people. And again, the power differentials with respect to passports, who gets to travel easily, who doesn't, sometimes tracks with wealth, sometimes tracks with nationality, with race. But in 19th century Europe, that concern about checking people wasn't as great because, again, it was mostly affluent, well-to-do people who were traveling, and governments kind of didn't worry about them. Then again, you're right, with the advent of modern mass air travel, something else happened with passports. And you'll probably notice that in your passport, maybe you haven't noticed, but along the bottom of your information page, there are a number of letters and numbers and then dashes and different punctuation marks between. And that's to make your passport machine readable. Now, you've probably seen this happen, even if you didn't know that's what you were watching. To get the information from your passport more quickly into a computer, you can swipe that code at the bottom, and it inputs the information directly into the computer. So the border doesn't have to type in your name, and then type in your birth date, and then type in your passport number. And that was something that, again, was encouraged. States didn't have to do this, but it was encouraged not even by the United Nations, but by a United Nations auxiliary branch called the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And they said in the 70s and 80s, when more and more people were traveling, it's just too cumbersome for us to check all these people in for flights manually. So could you please make passports machine readable so we can go zoop and the information goes straight into a computer? Now, of course, with biometrics now, you don't even have to swipe that machine readable bit. You can just sort of wave the chip. But because all passports are not biometric yet, that machine readable text is still included even in passports that do have biometrics. So yeah, and that was again, a result of the expansion of mass jet air travel. And that impacted that little line of code in the bottom of your passport. So very, very good question. Have you explored the phenomenon of countries revoking passports and leaving their former citizens stateless? And this is a very good question, but we need to break up two ideas. You can revoke a passport, but not render someone stateless. Your government can just say, sorry, we're not giving you a passport. You maintain your citizenship, but you just effectively can't travel. This goes against that universal human right, the right to travel, that is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that I mentioned during my talk. And this is done regularly. It was done commonly during the Cold War on both sides of the divide of East and West. Eastern Bloc countries did not let many of their citizens travel outside of the country for reasons of defection and other concerns. Similarly, people who were suspected communists in the United States, there are ample examples of them having their passports taken away because, again, there was worry that they might they could defect in the other direction. It's very common in the modern world with respect to the quote unquote war on terrorism that a number of countries have refused to give passports to people that they are worried would go off and engage in terrorist acts or go to terrorist training camps or what have you. There are a couple of high-profile examples of this from Australia, and these people brought essentially the Australian government to court to say, you can't deny me this. And the jurisprudence on this is divided. It's not sort of clear, again, that this right to travel is universal, both as a human right internationally, but also within a country, whether the government, because it's usually the ministerial prerogative of what will be the Secretary of State in the United States or in in Australia, the foreign minister, to decide. It's not subject to some sort of judicial review. And so that leads to a lot of legal complications that I won't get into, but you're absolutely right. Now, the question about statelessness is different, right? You could have a country, A, revoke a passport, and then B, revoke citizenship. And that's also happened. I mean, the famous example right now in the UK, there was an ISIS bride who went to Syria, to Iraq, and then the UK said, we're revoking your citizenship. Her parents initially were from Bangladesh, I believe. Anyway, but that's different. That's separate from a passport. You can have your passport revoked and not be rendered stateless. All right. Thank you for your presentation. Birth certificates are normally required for the issuance of passports. Do you have any knowledge of the UN Charter regarding the issuing of birth certificates? I don't think, I haven't read the UN Charter recently, but I'm pretty sure there isn't much in there about birth certificates, again, because it's the prerogative of individual states to count and document their citizens how they like. Most countries issue birth certificates, obviously, because you're right, you usually need that to get a passport. But to my knowledge, there's no international law around birth certificates. And I don't think in the UN Charter either. All right, one of the fascinating things about the old language in the passport is the language about the request or obligation of protection for the bearer on the part of the person or country to whom the passport is presented. Can you say more about this persistence and adoption of the language, especially in the modern period? Yeah, I mean, great question. About the persistence and adoption, that's just inertia. It was always in there, so they kind of keep it in there. That language has basically no purpose anymore. I mean, if a passport contains it or a passport doesn't contain it, you still get your consular assistance from your country of citizenship, or you're supposed to if you for example, get arrested in a country. And so whether it says, give this person help or not, there's certain help that is afforded to all passport holders when they're abroad, and that doesn't determine whether it's written in that archaic language, the passport, or not. In terms of who's asking for protection and how that works. Yeah, I mean, it's weird because in the past, and I'm talking about the distant past, passports were themselves kind of like a form of protection. The person giving the pass wouldn't say, please help this person. The person giving the pass would say, don't mess with this person. And if you mess with this person, I or my guys are coming after you. So that's a little different, asking for protection for the traveler versus sort of vouchsafing protection for the traveler. And that's, a bit of a change, but these things have changed a lot over time. I mean, sometimes passports were issued by the country receiving the traveler. Now passports are issued by the country that you are from when you go traveling. And so these changes have occurred regularly through history. All right, since the passport is indeed idiosyncratic, should they be seen as positive or negative in our world? That's what the lawyers would call a normative question. Historians, and I think I mentioned this in my talk, our job is to try and explain what happened in the past. Obviously, as an individual, I have views on whether they're positive or negative. And you saw my talk, you probably can guess what my views are. I'll get more, as I said, in a moment, to the fairness of passports and the power of different passports. And I think that is very negative. But the passport itself, it's just a product of history. And again, my first job as a historian is to try and explain how we got there without passing judgment on this was a good thing or this was a bad thing. Although obviously as individuals, the history should inform our views about whether this is now in our world today a good thing. And if not, what we can do possibly to try and change that. All right, here's the slavery question. Did you in your research come across an intersection between slavery and passports? Absolutely, there are a lot of intersections here. And this is something that I hope to look at in, not the book necessarily, I'll talk about slavery in the book, but the intersection between slavery and passports doesn't relate directly to this story about how we got the passport of today, which again is the main question I'm trying to answer in my book. But there's an important connection here, and so I do want to develop it probably in a journal article. Yes, the intersection that I find most both fascinating and troubling is that for some people, passports are your ticket to mobility, your ability to move, right? Again, we'll come back in a moment to the more and the less powerful passports. But in the case of slavery, the documents that enslaved peoples were trafficked by were very similar to passports, except they were limiting, I mean, ending these people's voluntary mobility rather than empowering it. And the reason I say they're similar is they would have a lot of the same information that passports had or even have today. They would have a description of the person who's enslaved, because in other ways it's like a passport, but it's also like a title to property. I mean, these were people being traded as property. And so, you had to know what you were purchasing or what you were trafficking. And so it would be like a passport, and that it would describe the person. It would be what causes them to move, but they're moving against their volition. They're being trafficked, they're being enslaved. And so whereas a piece of paper for one person, gets you through the door, gets you to travel, another piece of paper for this person is what absolutely ends their voluntary mobility. And so there's both this weird similarity between those two types of documents, but then the sad reality, they operate in precisely the opposite fashion. And that's something that is, like I said, both fascinating, but also harrowing, and something that I want to develop more, like I said, in a future piece of writing. All right, have you looked in your research on passports as a means to control population movement within the country and not only to pass for international travel? Yes, I mean, a lot of these passes have historically been used both for internal and external mobility. Now, again, back to my research question, because I'm looking at how we got to the place where we are today with, I don't have my passport in my hand right now like I did in the talk. Because that's my question, I'm more interested in the passes used for international travel. So I'm focusing more on that, but some of those passes used for international travel developed out of the passes used for internal travel. So in that sense, I look at some of these passes for internal travel that were used historically that, again, helped contribute to the development of the modern passport needed for international travel. But even in the era since we've had passports for international travel, there have been countries that limit internal movement. Again, the Soviet Union, not only did it restrict its citizens from traveling abroad, it restricted its citizens from moving around quite a bit within the country, sometimes for economic reasons. They didn't want people changing jobs. You weren't kind of allowed to do that. Sometimes it was for security reasons. Similar measures existed for a lot of time in the People's Republic of China that to prevent mass migration from rural areas to cities, you needed a pass to literally legally be able to go there and stay there and obtain government services there. Now, of course, people did this illicitly, but without that pass, you were breaking the rules. So there's a long history of controls of population by authorities for movement within their state. All right, there was a proposal in India a couple of years ago to provide low-income migrant workers with special orange-colored passports that would also require additional immigration checks to travel the Gulf. The plan was widely criticized for attempting to create second-class citizens and never got adopted. But I wonder, has there been other attempts in the past to create or reinforce class divisions through passports? So yes, absolutely. But again, this had to do more, just like with the last question, with internal movement. And I'm not even just talking now about the Soviet Union. In 19th century France, for example, you had what was called a carnet de travail or livret de travail. And it was a workbook, and it showed sort of what kind of jobs you were eligible for. You would, be essentially signed into work and out of work by the appropriate authorities, and you couldn't therefore go and work elsewhere if you weren't interested. Now, these were only given to workers, to the working class. Bankers or lawyers in 19th century France didn't need to carry these sorts of workbooks. So that's a perfect example of class differentiation, and its link to your ability to move around at that time the country in 19th century France. So there have certainly been links with internal movement. In terms of external movement, I'm not sure I can think of another example of a country proposing to make different classes of passports. Yeah, I'll have to give that some more thought, but that's a really good question. All right, so now there's a group of questions all related to the divide between the global north and the global south and the power of passports. So I'm going to read out, there are a couple of them, and I'm going to read them out, and then I'll kind of answer them all as a group. So the first of these questions was, do you see these idiosyncrasies in the global south encounter with passports as well? If yes, were they influenced by their counterparts in the global north? Very good question. Next question. So crises made passports more salient generally. I'm interested in what your research revealed about the factors that contributed to the uneven power of different passports across different countries. It seems to me that passports act like aggregators of interstate economic and military power, and I wonder how this came about. I've noticed, this is the third question, I've noticed that many of my brown-skinned friends get stopped at airports as opposed to their lighter-skinned friends until they show their American or British passports, and then they're treated with privilege again. It's somehow and I mean this in the least accusing tone possible, that the passport becomes an even more accepted show of power. Okay, again, three super questions, and they all intersect because it comes back to this point about the power of passports and the power of different passports, because not all passports give their bearer the same mobility. And that goes against, again, this highfalutin human right about everyone's right to free movement. Some people enjoy more than others. And the last question, I guess I'll take first. It's weird because it's sometimes not even about the person. It's even more about the passport, right? The brown-skinned person who is assumed to hold a less powerful passport, suddenly when they show the more powerful British or American passport, suddenly gets more mobility. So that shows that it's not even really about the individual. It's more just about the idea. I mean, you could say the stereotype behind people who hold certain passports and the power of that passport. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, a function of this uneven, totally unregulated global regime with respect to passports. It's also a function of racism. And so there's a lot that intersects there in that reality that you identify and that I've heard and sort of witnessed myself from many of my friends experiencing. So yeah, you know, I agree with you. It's the show of power of the passport is even sort of more than the individual who's holding the passport. How that came about. So this is the second question. How did that system where this passport system acts like aggregators of interstate economic and military power, how did this come about? That's a good question. Like, how did the modern world come about? How did we get to a situation where, you know, some countries are more powerful than others, some countries are more wealthy than others, and how that then translates into the quote unquote power of those countries' passports? I mean, a big part of that is colonialism. A lot of the countries that are that have quote unquote more powerful passports are former colonial powers. The colonized powers are often the ones that have less powerful passports. That's one of the things that contributes to this hierarchy. A lot of the wealth in those European countries came from historically from their colonial activities, their expropriation of wealth from around the world. There is legacies of that still to this day. And so there are so many things that contribute to that, but it's sort of just, a fact of life. I'm not saying that to excuse anything, but what I mean by that is there have been these power differentials with respect to passports or passport-like documents and who can travel that go back through history. So again, I'm not trying to excuse the system in the world today. As I said earlier, I think it's a very wrong, ethically wrong thing that is just a reality of the world today. But it's also been a reality of much of human history, that there are people who are more powerful and more wealthy and those who aren't. And how we get to a system globally where that's not the case, or where we try and mitigate or go beyond that sort of inequality, whether it's military inequality, whether it's racial inequality, whether it's wealth inequality, that's a question that goes far beyond the passport. And the person who figures that all out, wins the last Nobel Peace Prize, and we all live happily ever after. First question about, in this group about questions about the global South and global North is the idiosyncrasies in the development of the global South's encounter with passports. And again, I think the biggest idiosyncrasy here is colonialism, right? As I said in my talk, these passports developed out of, for the most part, European travel documents in European history. And how did we get to a situation where this document that developed out of mostly European antecedents then is used around the world today? Again, colonialism. That's the both simple but also huge answer. European, again, for the most part, European countries imposed European forms of national identity or the trappings of national identity, the forms of national bureaucracy, a lot of that got exported, imposed on a lot of countries. And in the period after decolonization, a lot of countries that had recently achieved independence sort of just kept going with the forms that these European colonial powers had imposed and then left on them. As I think I said in my talk about the African Union, African countries could just say, screw this, we don't want this colonial heritage passport system. We're going to, like in the Schengen zone, create a Pan-African passport-free zone. Now, because passports are required bilaterally, right? Individual African countries or African countries as a whole could make that agreement. But if they still wanted to go to China, or if they still want to go to Argentina, or if they still want to go to Canada, those countries could still require a passport to let people from Africa to enter. And so this doing away with passports and the idiosyncrasy of the global South's relation to passports is only going to work so far as they get other countries to agree with them. And again, because of power differentials, they're probably not going to get the ability to travel as easily in the global north without a travel document recognized by the global north, but they could do away with it amongst themselves in the global south. And that would be another great example of the idiosyncrasy of this system, because again, one of the biggest idiosyncrasies of this system is that it's never been codified. So that is a possibility. There's no global rules about this. So different groups, just like, you know, the European Union, the Schengen zone, could just do their own thing. And it'd be great to see if that happened in other parts of the world, other than you know, continental Europe. All right. So the next group of passports, the next group of questions, there are two of them here about golden passports. This kind of relates to what we were talking about in terms of the power of passports, because people who have weak passports sometimes want to get a stronger one. And again, sometimes the passport matters more than the holder. And if you're wealthy enough from a country with a weak passport, you can purchase your way into a stronger passport. Why not, right? So the first question is, what's your view of the emerging golden passport industry, buying easy travel documents for donations or investments? And then the second question on this subject is, what are your thoughts on the emergence of golden passport schemes in Europe and elsewhere that seem to indicate not all passports are equal and that states with better passports are capitalizing on this, offering their passports to sale? What does this say about citizenship and identity? Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, this clearly indicates, as you know, we've been discussing now for quite a bit, that passports are not equal. As I said before, all passports are not, you know, giving the same mobility to their holders. And the golden passport scheme is frankly a very cynical example of that truth, that countries that have relatively more powerful passports are literally cashing in on it. And you know, for the people who come from a country or who carry a passport that's relatively weak compared to their golden passport opportunity, you know, you can't really fault them. And again, now we're making normative comments. This is less about the history now, about like, you know, about the question, that's what I think about this. You know, I think it's a pretty obvious result of the system being so unfair, and then that unfairness intersecting with capitalism, and capitalism sort of people always finding a way to in this case, countries to make money off of something that they have and something that other people want. So in that sense, it sort of makes sense that this arose. But again, the ideal, if you're asking me what I think, the ideal would be a situation where people don't need to go after these golden passports because we all enjoy the same or relatively the same mobility. Now, you know, that's me being extremely, I went from the cynical reality of this to the, you know, hopeful optimism that maybe we can get to a point in human history where this sort of thing won't be necessary, because we will all have a greater freedom to travel that's more equitably shared across the planet. That's the only way I think that these golden passports would ever sort of then disappear. And again, back to the point about unregulated, no one can stop these countries from doing that because there aren't rules at the international level saying you can't do that. They can get coaxed and cajoled by other countries, because again, this is so much about bilateral relations. There's a country in the Caribbean that has a golden passport scheme that, and I'm not going to say which country because I can't remember if I have this 100% correct. I mean, I have the story correct. I can't remember if I have the country correct, so I don't want to possibly slander the wrong country. But the golden passport scheme has been accused to be linked to money laundering operations. And so again, this country can do it because it can give passports to whoever it wants. Sovereign prerogative of a state to give a passport to its citizens or to its new citizens because they've invested money. But that doesn't prevent another state or a powerful state that has a big control over the global financial services industry, like the United States, saying, look, this is sketchy. We're going to start freezing asset transfers coming into and out of your country because we're afraid that your golden passport scheme is actually a massive sort of being used by international bad people, to help launder money. It's a complicated situation. So again, a lot of this operates sometimes between states bilaterally or in groups, as I said before, like the African Union or the European Union, the Schengen zone in Europe. All right, 2 questions about COVID. What do I think about vaccine passports? Will they become as important as normal passports? And the second question, what do you think about vaccine passports? I think it adds another complication to passports and travel because it implies that only people with access to vaccines are allowed to cross borders. Would love to hear your opinion. I miss you, Professor. Oh, thank you. I don't know who that was, but yeah, I mean, in short answer to the first question about will they become more important? I don't think so. I think the standard ubiquitous obligatory passport is here to stay, and it's probably going to maintain its status as kind of like the arch necessary document, but will sort of accessory documents also be required, like vaccine passports going forward, especially, if the COVID pandemic is with us for the next couple of years to stay. I think it's likely that will become, like I said, an accessory document to your passport, whether that information gets included ultimately in your passport. We're going to talk in a second. There are a lot of questions about the future of passports. It could go either way, right? Whether, again, like when I traveled to the States, I had to carry my document saying I'd been vaccinated to get back here into Qatar. In that sense, it was as important as my passport because they weren't going to let me in the country without both, or they were going to let me in the country. They just weren't going to let me in without doing the hotel quarantine. Yes, in terms of the second question, it absolutely adds yet another complication to this uneven system, this unfairness about who gets to travel and who doesn't travel, because now we've added not just, as we discussed before, there's the economic element, there's the nationality element, there's the racial element. Now we're adding an access to healthcare element, which is sometimes connected to affluence, to socioeconomic, but not always, right? And so, it's just adding another layer to who gets to do what based on their access to what. And now access to vaccines is becoming possibly another impediment to travel, and for some an impediment to travel, and for some a facilitator of travel. The lucky ones who get the vaccines. And so there was something in the news literally this morning about it wasn't a court ruling, but I think it was a ministerial opinion in the UK about how something like COVID passports could potentially go against certain laws about possibly this, about, some people who don't have access to healthcare. Well, if you require them to have this and they can't, that would create problems and again, unfairness. And that was in the national context of the UK. I can't remember the exact details. I only read the headline, not the whole story. But yeah, you're 100% correct, whoever you are who misses me. It adds just another layer to who can travel. And this time it's who has access to good healthcare, to the vaccine in particular. All right, the last couple of questions all have to do with the future of passports. There were many of them here, so I'm going to read them really quickly. Any suggestions on how to modernize passports to move away from booklets? Do you have security concerns? We would passports on our phones, etc. And what about, again, individuals not being able to afford that technology, and that would be a further limit to people's mobility. Next question, what's the possibility for the extinction of passports in the future with the possible replacement and the use by retina scans and whatnot? Do you see the future of passports, again, just eye retina scans, ear prints or fingerprints? That way the passport will never expire except on the death of the person. Now we can think of having visas and other travel requirements for visiting nations sent to mobile phones, QR codes. Do you see this coming in the next 10 years? Would passports be replaced with virtual passports stored in cloud servers? Biometrics, fingerprints, iris scans are all emerging technologies that could be used to recognize people. Do you foresee a time when passports will be a thing of the past, or are they going to be more complicated? And would you see a better alternative, in your opinion, to passports today, something that would address both the economic and security concerns of most countries? So I think I said this in the talk. I'm almost certain I said this in the talk. I try as a historian not to make predictions about the future. My job is about understanding, trying to help explain what went on in the past to my students, to my readers, to, in this case, my viewers. And again, thank you for tuning in to the talk and this Q&A extra session, if you have done so. I just don't know. I would hazard a guess that yes, some of those changes, which one I don't know, but some of those changes with respect to retina scans or will probably be incorporated. It has already started in some countries in their biometrics to be incorporated in passports and the information that's in that electronic, little chip in your passport. But just like photographs, when they were introduced, it's haphazard. Some are going to adopt, some are going to adopt something else. Most countries will probably adopt something, and then the countries that adopted something else will back up and do what the other countries are doing. Again, because there are no rules about this, no one's going to force anyone to do anything unless a global passport convention comes along in the future, which I doubt. So it'll be, again, this story of fits and starts, this story of idiosyncrasy, this story of power differentials influencing how the document ultimately develops, because that's how the document has developed up until now. So I can't tell you exactly what those changes will look like, but I'm confident in venturing guess that changes of that nature will continue. Going back to the French Revolution and that moment where we started wanting to identify the bearer more certainly. So they started writing on descriptions, and then photographs were included, and then biometrics were included. That's a process that I don't see disappearing. And so how that greater ability for the authorities to identify us is included in future passports, I'm not exactly sure, but that is coming. I think we can hazard a guess that that's probably in the future of passports. Whether they'll be replaced by just storage in the cloud or QR phones for visas in our QR codes in our phones for visas. Again, I don't know, but I don't think it's going to go that far. The fact that these weird anachronistic paper booklets have subsisted into the 21st century, I don't see them disappearing into the cloud and blockchain, being used anytime soon. I think that while small changes and little innovations like putting a picture in or including biometrics are possible, and as I said, then some people adopt the same thing. Gradually, most people adopt it. Next thing you know, everyone's pretty much got that machine-readable data in their passports. Big changes, like one country sort of saying, we're abolishing passports and we're going just up into the cloud. That's something that it would be very hard for that first country to do, because maybe countries other than it won't let its citizens travel without the good old paper passport. And so it would need, for a big change like that to occur, it would need a lot of buy-in. It would need, probably the more powerful, the superpowers of the time to really force that on everyone else. That's the only way I see a big change like that coming about. Yeah, that's what I really have to say about the future of passports. We just don't know. But going back to this last question, which links to a couple of the earlier questions about, what would a better alternative be? That's, again, this normative question, right? Not what's happened and the historian's job to explain how that happened, or this historian's guess about what might happen, but what would be better? And again, I answered this before. In my opinion, what would be better, and this is just me talking, is a world where we can all go where we want, and where people's nationality, race, socioeconomic status doesn't determine whether they can legally travel. Obviously, socioeconomic status determines whether you can afford to travel, but socioeconomic status with respect to even your access to these documents or the vaccine to get the vaccine passport, that's just another level of socioeconomic disadvantage beyond the first level of socioeconomic disadvantage. So, of course, I would like a world where those inequalities, those disadvantages have disappeared, and we can all, roam freely on the planet, as our ancestors did so long ago. And some ancestors did not so long ago, like Leo in the late or 19th and early 20th century in Titanic, and other people who were, again, affluent Europeans at that time. May we never return to a system on this planet where certain people are trafficked against their will with those very similar to passport documents, but those were the property deeds of these other human beings, which were, like I said, similar, but doing the opposite thing as a passport, empowers other people to move. And so, but that's me hoping for overall a better world, not just a world without passports. So a world without passports would require a lot of changes to make this world that better place. Anyway, those are all the questions. Thanks again for tuning in for the talk and for this extra talk. And yeah, I love this topic so much. And if you do too, I hope you'll read the book when I get it done. So again, thank you very much.